This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we have a fantastic show today. We've got a lot to cover as usual. There's a lot of breaking and important news going on right now. We're not going to get to everything today, but we continue to be reporting and broadcasting Arab Talk from our remote locations in Northern California. Pandemic, from many perspectives, Jamal, continues unabated and continues to get worse. We've had over 200,000 Americans who have perished. Over 6 million people are infected, and there's no sign of it letting up anytime soon in the middle of flu season. On top of that, we had the untimely death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which, if there's time, I have quite a bit to say about that. But more importantly, Jamal, we're entering an era of rather significant internet censorship happening yet again in the 21st century. Censorship of pro-Palestine speech and pro-Palestine narratives yet again are being hammered, not only by pro-Israel forces within the United States and the Israeli Hasbara, Jamal, but social media giants have jumped on the bandwagon censoring free speech in this country. It's quite a time.
It is quite a time, and it's actually a very bad time for the First Amendment, academic freedom. And this is a time just when everyone, as you know, because of the pandemic, you and I are speaking, remotely. All teaching is happening on Zoom and other platforms. And so more and more people are relying on these platforms. And so now it means that these giant corporations are deciding what can you say or you cannot say, who can you invite on a webinar and who you can't invite on a webinar. So to put this into perspective, we're going to hear from Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi. Of course, Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi, she is the director of Ahmed Studies, or Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas at San Francisco State University. And for our audience here, we spoke to her before her webinar. She had a scheduled webinar at San Francisco State University yesterday on Wednesday. And we spoke to her before the webinar and what was the webinar about and all the attacks that were mounted to stop this webinar from happening. And of course, these giant corporations that you've mentioned succumbed to the pressure, and Zoom basically censored the webinar, did not carry that webinar and stopped it. So did Facebook and YouTube to different degrees here. So let's listen to Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi. There is a planned webinar. It's called A Conversation with Layla Khalid, moderated by Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi and Dr. Tomomi Kinokawa. And of course, Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi, we've had her on the show many times. She's the director of Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies, Ahmed. And Dr. Kinokawa is from the Women and Gender Studies. So this is a webinar that has been planned way in advance. It looks like, from what I saw, almost 1,000 people, maybe more.
1,300.
1,300 people have signed on to it, and it has been causing a ruckus again on San Francisco State University. A lot of complaints from Jewish organizations, Zionist organizations, trying to stop the webinar from happening, and at the same time making all kinds of claims. So before we delve into it, really, I want you, Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi, to explain to me what is this webinar about.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Jamal, for having me on Jamal and Jess show, Arab Talk Radio. I'm very excited to be back. Let me just give a little bit background. The webinar is called Whose Narratives Gender, Justice and Resistance, a conversation with Layla Khalid. And it's featuring Layla Khalid, the long-time Palestinian militant, feminist, and revolutionary icon, along with Roni Kasriels, who is anti-Zionist, Jewish organizer, long time member of the African National Congress in South Africa, and served in ministerial positions, and also a member of the Palestine Solidarity Committee Alliance in South Africa. We also have Rula Abu Daho, who is a feminist scholar, activist in Palestine, and also the acting director of the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit University, which is the first and continues to be the best and the best rated, top rated women's studies program throughout the region. And I'm talking about throughout, whether we talk about Arab country, whether we talk about Turkey, Iran, Israel, and so on. It's the best. Everybody knows the program. And then we also have Laura Whitehorn, who is anti-Zionist Jewish activist organizer, who is actually co-founder of Releasing Aging People in Prison. She herself is a former prisoner who spent 14 years in prison and has been released and has been quite active, and was a member actually of the first U.S. Prisoner Solidarity Delegation to Palestine that I co-organized and led in 2016, and has earned us also a lot of attacks by Zionist groups. And last but not least, Sekou Odinga. Sekou Odinga is a former Black Panther, a member of that Liberation Army back in the days, spent many, many years in prison, around 30 years or so, and also is very active, continues to be very active in Black liberation today in New York. So the panel is actually quite distinguished. And the reason we set the panel together, it's going to be Wednesday tomorrow. It's going to be Wednesday on the 23rd. It is scheduled for Wednesday, the 23rd of September at 12:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. And the reason for that is because we are doing it as two open classrooms by Professor Tomi Kinakawa from Women and Gender Studies. She's bringing two of her classes, Women's Studies 150, which each one has 68 students, along with my Ahmed Studies classes and other classes. Now, the history for this, I think, is really important. Professor Kinakawa reached out to me back in fall 2019 and asked if I would be willing. She was doing two classes around Palestinian Arab feminist issues, Muslim feminist issues, if I would be happy to come and speak in her class as a guest speaker. And she would understand if I couldn't, because I was really busy. And I said, no, I would be very happy to come and speak. And she said one of the things that she wanted to assign in her class were some of my writings around Layla Khalid, around the history of Palestinian women, around my work on Assata Shakur and so on, the whole question of women, militancy, gender, resistance, and so on. And so we had that. We organized that in April. COVID-19 took place, so all the classes were converted to online. She asked me again, and I said, sure, I would be very happy to do it. So we actually had a very, very successful webinar on April 6th, which is available on Ahmed Studies Facebook page. And we showed the film, Layla Khalid Hijacker, with a question mark. And we also read the material, and we had a very, very lively discussion with students, with faculty. It's available. People can check it. As a result, and then we did also another webinar on gender, queer justice on 2 days later. So it was about gender and sexuality in Arab and Muslim communities. We both were quite excited about it. And then we decided we're going to do it this semester as well. And as you know, as yourself a lecturer at San Francisco State in the Ahmed Studies program, we all bring guest speakers to our classes because students really benefit and learn from having live discussions. So we decided to do the same thing again. And this time we thought about, rather than actually having readings only and showing films, since we're doing everything online, why not actually try to get live people to participate and speak to the students? One of the reasons we were very encouraged is that Professor Kinakawa received over 15 pages of very positive evaluation from the students. The students loved it. They said they learned so much. So we thought, oh yeah, if you build on the success. So we organize this, and this is part of it. And our webinar on queer justice is going to be on October 19th, actually. And this is part of the series of Ahmed webinars. We've done many of them. I mean, in July when we had the webinar with Angela Davis and other leading Black scholars, Robin Kelly, Gerald Horn, Dio Gore, and Beverly Gishaftal, we have now 9,000 views watches. So people are very much interested and actually quite grateful. The students and the faculty and the community they're very interested in hearing things about topics that they don't get to hear about generally.
Yeah, so let me clarify a couple of things. One is we're having this interview with you. This is not a promotional interview for the webinar, because by the time we air this interview, the webinar would have happened. And this is not because we know that you have more people who have signed up than you planned originally for.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
you're just like, you have actually a lot of people, cannot even watch it. They'll have to use other, the Ahmed page, live streaming it and other things, basically as an auxiliary to that webinar itself. So that's
And can I just say something, Jamal? Actually,
Yeah.
we have actually received, Dr. Kinakawa and I received so many requests from so many professors at so many universities asking us if they can bring in their classes. And we said, please, of course, by all means, come and bring your classes. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an open webinar. You have a lot of people. And I want to look at the main objection here, and from the student Jewish group Hillel on campus, supported by multiple Zionist organizations throughout, because according to the president of San Francisco State University, she has received hundreds, if not thousands, of emails complaining about the webinar, saying that, Layla Khalid and the organization she belonged to, the PLFP, is on the terror list of the United States. So that's the main, objection. What do you say to this?
Well, first of all, this is not new. Pro-Israel groups have historically tried to silence the Palestinian voice the same way as Israel tries to erase Palestinians. Again and again and again, Israel would not be able to justify its existence unless it erases Palestine and say this is a land without people for a people without a land. So the Palestinian existence in itself is a big trouble. Secondly, Israel has failed to convince the world public opinion of sympathy, and most importantly, in the United States, Israel has really failed. So we now have polls after polls of actually almost equal numbers of people sympathetic to Palestine, which we have never seen that in the past. And big part of this community is actually Jewish people, and including young Jews on campuses who are saying, we're really troubled by what Israel is doing. We don't want our name to be signed to it, and so on. So the pro-Israel groups, Israel lobby groups, are very, very troubled by it. So let's just keep that in mind. And they have waged so many campaigns. Historically, myself, I've been at San Francisco State for 14 years. I have not had a chance, maybe less than a year and so on. I breathed, but then it's been the attacks continued against me, against other faculty, against students, against people who are civil rights organization, civic organization, and so on. Because within the elections, the presidential elections, and so on, the goal is to silence the Palestinian narrative, to silence Palestinians from speaking what their minds are, to let people know what's going on, to connect the question of justice for Palestine with the question of justice for all. And we've been actually, I should say that, Ahmed, we've been actually quite successful as doing this and actually connecting the whole question of the production of justice. So they're very bothered with it. So they pick on this. And actually, we did not invite Layla Khalid as a member of the PFLP. If we wanted to have a discussion of Palestinian groups, this is not the kind of discussion we will have. This is not the kind of webinar. If we were teaching a topic that actually addresses that, why not have all the Palestinian groups come on webinar and speak up their opinions, which is something that CNN does, which is something that Fox News does, lesser so because they're not as expressive of diversity of opinion. Everybody does that. So why not on a university campus?
Well, here I want to clarify. I want to clarify also the confusion, because the attacks, and I've read at least one of the letters basically sent by the Jewish Community Federation to President Lynn Mahoney. But the way the narrative in it makes it sound as if Layla Khalid is coming to campus and hurting, affecting the Hillel students, or the Hillel students are excluded, or whatever. This is just to be clear. This is a webinar That's because, as you mentioned earlier, now all education is done online. The San Francisco State University campus has been shut down since last March, right?
And all classes are converted to online classes.
So
all
they're
classes.
converted, yeah, exactly. And then you've said, I think, something very important. You have interviews, conducted by CNN, by CBS, all kinds of people from Afghanistan to Iraq to Palestine. And that's part of the First Amendment. And then, of course, there is, in your case, not only the First Amendment, but also freedom for academia, and that's what they're objecting about.
Right, and I think this is also the problem is that it's first of all, I also should say that two of the panelists out of the four speakers, two are actually Jewish. So it's not. I don't think they're bothered of Jewish feelings are being bothered. Zionists within the Jewish community are being bothered because neither the university president, nor the administration, nor anyone else actually asked what other Jewish students who don't support Zionism think, what other Jewish faculty, and we have a lot of Jewish faculty at SFSU, what do they think about that? Are they bothered by it? Are they troubled by it? Nobody has bothered ask community groups who are actually growing, like Jewish Voice for Peace, like many groups, scholars and so on, within the Bay Area and in the US and internationally. What do you think about that? And it's completely the way it's the same attacks, Jamal. When Lawfare sued me, they said, oh, and she's traveling to Palestine and here and there, and she met with Layla Khalid and Sheikh Ra'ed Salah, which is the same old charge that they did in 2014. And I said, I organized meetings with 198 Palestinians, including Layla Khalid and Sheikh Ra'ed Salah. But it's very convenient for the Zionists to pick on a couple of people because they want to whip up the war on terror and Islamophobia. They want to whip up anti-Palestinianism, and they really want to deflect attention from how exciting this webinar is. Why is it really important to think about narratives and so on? And actually, the executive director of Lawfare, I don't know if you recall, Jamal, but I think you do, that the Lawfare director herself, Brooke Goldstein, actually in her video said, oh, and I met with Hamas, and I met with this, and I met with that. So why is it you're allowed to actually meet and interview, but it's not allowed for anybody else? Is this that the Palestinians are exceptionalized and Palestinian voices are supposed to be silent?
Let me also just remind our listeners on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM, and of course our viewers on YouTube and on Facebook, that Hillel hosted on campus the former mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barkat, who basically is a gun-touting mayor who basically was encouraging Israelis to arm themselves against Palestinians. And we can go on with a long list of former terrorists, Zionist terrorists, starting with Menachem Begin, who was the leader of the Irgun terror group, Yitzhak Shamir, who was responsible for the multiple bombings and killings of civilians, and wanted, by the way, by the British government, Ariel Sharon, the mastermind behind the Sabra and Shatila massacres, and many other examples who later on not only came to the United States, but they were at the White House, at Congress,
received the highest honors
at the State Department. So here we see the double standard. When you're only having a webinar, a discussion hosted by Ahmed, and actually you're just doing it online.
Yes, and I think it's really, really important to also think about who defines what's terrorism and who does not define what's terrorism. I mean, Nelson Mandela, until 1994, was considered a terrorist. Many people who have been organized day in and day out also have been considered a terrorist. So because of the political convenience of Israel and the United States, not a single Israeli war criminal actually was brought to justice. Meanwhile, Layla Khalid, one of her claims to fame is that she hijacked two planes back in 1969, 1970. That's her claim to fame. So they are latching onto that. And I want to bring us up, Jamal, to the main point is that they have a serious problem with this. They basically are not even speaking about who are our guests, what's the purpose of it, what's the title, what's the content of the webinar. And the other one that we did in April is also available. And some of them, by the way, cited it. I think cited it. And so which means that they are fully aware of it. But the truth doesn't really matter. The truth doesn't matter when you have a lobby of a very strong government that is abusing and violating rights and trying to get away with it and trying to present itself as exceptional, that it should be above the law and it should not be held accountable. So the deflection from what we are trying to do by trying to spotlight the light on us, because when they say that, they actually ignore the history and the fact that the writing about Layla Khalid and writing by her and the films about her are actually on almost all women's studies classes. I mean, everybody studies that as they study other leading women, talk about it. Sometimes you agree, sometimes you don't agree. Not everybody agrees with the same strategies or the discourse, which is okay, because that's what critical knowledge is all about. That's what we should be teaching our students. And so they deflect and they try to actually evacuate this rich content of the classrooms to pick on one thing and continue attacking it. And honestly, my colleague and I, we decided to not respond to any of the interviews.
Well, I mean, I see a lot of responses. I mean, I know the community is responding, and I feel the urge also to, put the truth forward, because I'm also kind of surprised that after, for example, the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco has been exposed in multiple articles. Most of these articles, by the way, were in Jewish publications, of how they were misusing their funds. And doesn't need a lot of research. People can do that, And they have been using their funds that people basically donate to support the Jewish community, to support art and whatever. But basically they were using these funds to support illegal colonial settlements on stolen Palestinian land, and stoking Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab sentiments all across, supporting basically far-right groups such as Canary Mission, Turning Point USA, the Tea Party Patriots, anti-gay groups such as the Heritage Foundation, and Southern Poverty Law Center designated anti-Muslim groups such as Act for America and the Center for, this is to name a few. The list is so long, Dr. Abdulhadi.
And Jamal, all of them by the list includes every single group that has attacked us.
Yes,
from Amcha to David Horowitz to
They believe that people's memory is so short. And this is, we're talking about a year ago, 2 years ago. They started to get exposed, basically, through their tax returns.
Right.
And they've been very silent. They were making excuses of, we made a mistake supporting Canary Mission. We're going to stop giving them the $100,000 a year. But looking at their tax returns for 10 years, they've spent in the neighborhood of $100 million
That's right.
to stalk Islamophobia and support hate groups.
And silence academic freedom. And
yes, and now they're saying, they're one of the leaders of this campaign, basically to defame Ahmed and defame you personally and making excuses. Now, I want to go into also a op-ed that the president of San Francisco State published in the J Weekly on September 14th, and in it there were some positive points. Then the rest goes downhill, in my opinion. But she said, at least, that she's committed to academic freedom and the ability of faculty to conduct their teaching and scholarship without censorship. I mean, that's kind of the position she has taken.
That's everybody's position. That's the law. That is the law. I mean,
but I'm just saying, in her thing, then, of course, the bad thing about her article is that it was totally one-sided.
It wasn't just one-sided. I mean, Jamal, the thing is, it was even worse than that. President Mahoney said to community people, to community groups, that she is actually going to stand by Ahmed, she's going to support Ahmed, that she's going to fight against Islamophobia, anti-Arab discrimination, and then turned around and did something completely different. She wrote a memo to the campus and said that I am against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, and that, okay, that's really great. I support academic freedom. But then she also jumped in and said in that memo, even before we talk about the J Weekly, she said that I abhor terrorism and violence and so on. But she also said that she talked to Hillel and she talked to other Jewish community groups who are Zionist groups and so on. So we know that she's talked to them because they're all affirming that. She has not once reached out to me, to Professor Tumomi, to any of our students. She hasn't talked to any of us. Again, as if we are not part of this campus. Like we're completely, the only important thing is for her to satisfy the Zionists and really pro-Israeli donors. And it's very interesting because the letter that's coming from the Jewish Community Federation to President Mahoney is dated the same day that she published her op-ed in J Weekly. The J Weekly op-ed also, curiously enough, eliminated all the discussion around Islamophobia, anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, and so on, removed it all. And only talked about, she's talking to only one audience. She's talking to the pro-Israel Zionist audience. That's her audience. None of us is her audience. None of the Black students on campus or faculty, nobody who cares about Islamophobia is talked to. But she also, when she cited Judge Brandeis, she said that she equated what we are doing with evil. I mean, this is the word she used. It's in her letter. And that is very, very troubling for a professor who actually specializes in history. Dr. Mahoney always says that I am a historian. I am a historian. I abhor, she says, white nationalism. She doesn't use white supremacy. I want to support Black lives and so on. But then what you say, this is completely contradictory to what you claim in different places. So she has different discourses for different audiences, number one, which is actually not very good for an academic who claims to be unbiased. Secondly, she's totally one-sided. Third, she has not talked to her faculty. It's not difficult to find me. It's not difficult to know who I am. She knows who I am. And I have reached out to her multiple times by myself, with the students, and the committee has reached to her on my behalf. So it's actually quite problematic. And to me, it seems that this is part of the institutional memory and the institutional stains of San Francisco State that continues to refuse to allow us to build our program, to teach, to protect us with the same protection, equal protection. We're supposed to be equally protected under the law, like everybody else. So there is a prioritizing of Zionist organizations because also there are the donations money, there are the pressures, because the Zionists also have the time to sit down and write 100,000 letters and so on. We don't have the resources. But there has been a lot of support from our community. It takes a little bit longer always because we're a grassroots group,
When in a communication with Dr. And President Mahoney, she said that her obligation is to, I'm quoting, to my students, and that she always will reach out to them, and that she offers, GUPS, and other Arab and Muslim organizations the same level of commitment and support that she gives to everyone.
That's not true. I'm sorry, but that's really not accurate, with all due respect. First of all, when President Mahoney's office reached out to me to help bring groups, actually I did ask GUPS, Muslim Student Association, Muslim Women Student Association, and Afghan Student Association. We met with her. The students presented her with a lot of concerns. Not a single concern that they have raised has been addressed now. She has not reached out to GUPS. She has not reached out to me. It's also, by the way, a problem to say I'm only going to reach out to students and only not to reach out to the community and to the faculty as well, because she's doing that also elsewhere. And so she has not reached out to them. Actually, GUPS and Students for Justice in Palestine elsewhere have organized a petition and sent the petition that garnered over 1,000 people within like less than 3 days. They sent to President Mahoney. President Mahoney has not responded to them, has not even given them a response. Students have invited her last year to attend the Palestinian mural event. She said, sorry, I'm not available. Students, Muslim students invited her to come to their annual. She has not attended a single event for any of the Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian students. Meanwhile, she also announced that she has been breaking bread with Zionist schools. By the way, she's not talking to anti-Zionist Jewish students, only Zionist students. She's breaking bread with Hillel. She meets with them, and she said on Shabbat, because it's also quoted in some of the Zionist organizations. So even if you want to look at it on the face of it, you don't even want to get critically discussion with it as an intellectual. Even on the face of it, there is total disparate treatment. There is totally different ways of treating our communities than the way she is actually treating the Zionist wing of the Jewish community, not the whole Jewish community, I want to emphasize, the Zionist wing of that, which is quite offensive to us, Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, the study of Arab Muslims and Palestinians, as well as the study of Jewish studies that is not Zionist, and our Jewish sisters and brothers in the community. It's offensive to all of us because we're all excluded, and the only groups that she's catering to and meeting with and doing a lot of outreach and deference to and so on are the pro-Israel Zionists. And I think this is quite shameful, actually, in today's and age, because we know what Israel is doing in Palestine and how many human rights violations, international laws that are violated day in and day out. So that's actually quite troubling, especially for a scholar of history who should really know history.
We have a couple of minutes, and in these 2 minutes, I want to go back to the webinar. What do you think people? What's your expectations, or what?
I'm very excited.
What do you think people are going to get out of it?
I'm very, very excited because we actually have prepared a lot of readings. We have prepared a lot of videos. We are sharing a lot of resources for it to be able to have discussions. I really want us to think about how is history told and retold? How critical can we come up with different narratives and think about it? What does gender and justice and resistance have to do with it? How do they play out elsewhere? What does it mean, for example, when people say, where is your Mandela? I want to pose that question to Rani Kasril and see about that. What's happening with Palestinian women's studies? These are the things that we're expecting. And I think this is why, Jamal, we have so much response. We have so much support. People cannot wait for it to happen. And we're really happy to be able to provide this kind of service. It's our responsibility to share it with our community, with our students, with our faculty, and I'm saying all over the world, and have it become something that people can always go back to and use as a resource. That's our job as educators, and that's what we're doing.
Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi, the director of Ahmed, thank you again for coming on Arab Talk, and hope to talk to you very soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Jamal.
Well, that's the voice of Professor Rabab Abdulhadi, co-founder and director of the Ahmed program at San Francisco State, talking about her webinar. Now, Jamal, it's important. You did this interview with Professor Abdulhadi before the decision to censor her webinar. And just to put it in context, this is not just craziness on the internet that there's quite a bit of, which gets posted all the time. This is a legitimate academic webinar done in the context of learning and education. And we have in this country white supremacists and hate groups all the time spewing absolute condemnable hate speech all the time on Zoom, on Twitter, on Facebook Live, on all of these platforms. Yet, and we see that Professor Abdulhadi's webinar, in fact, got censored in an academic context. It's truly outrageous.
I mean, we can get into the details because in the discussion with Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi, she talks about it. But also, this is important to point out the double standard.
Yes.
When it comes to who gets censored and who
doesn't,
who doesn't, and also who goes on the U.S. terror list and who doesn't. I mean, it's kind of like ironic that most or several leaders from the Israeli government who were hosted at the White House, at the State Department, at Congress, they were on the terror list, on the British terror list, like Yitzhak Shamir, Menachem Begin. Yitzhak Shamir is notorious for the bombing of the King David Hotel, which killed like more than 80 people and injured hundreds. And so, and of course, it's a reminder that also up till the early 90s, Nelson Mandela was also on the terror list of the State Department. He was banned to come to address the United Nations under the Reagan administration. They wouldn't give him a visa, and then later on, he's a hero. So I'm not going to get into all these, but also we've had a very important discussion with Jillian York,
Right.
Director for the Internet Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation,
Right.
EFF. Let's also listen to Jillian. Joining Arab Talk from Berlin, Jillian C York. Jillian is Electronic Frontier Foundation Director for International Freedom of Expression and is based in Berlin, Germany. Her work examines state and corporate censorship and its impact on culture and human rights, with an emphasis on marginalized communities. At EFF, she leads onlinecensorship.org and works on platform censorship and accountability, state censorship, the impact of sanctions, and digital security. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Jillian.
Thank you for having me again. It's good to see you.
As you are aware of, on Wednesday, Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook have all censored a webinar co-moderated by two professors at San Francisco State University, Professor Rabab Abdulhadi, Director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Program, and Professor Tomomi Kinukawa from the Department of Women and Gender Studies. And this webinar was called Whose Narratives, Gender, Justice and Resistance. In your line of work, has this happened before? Especially since now, with the pandemic, students, academics, journalists, and so on are more and more dependent on these platforms.
Yes. Yeah, so this is something that we see happen quite often. And I want to give just like a quick background here. So there's a little bit of a misconception that we saw happen this week and that I've seen in a number of other cases that it's illegal to host anyone who might be affiliated with a US designated terrorist organization. And again, I should say that I'm not a lawyer, but I work with a lot of First Amendment lawyers and I've done a lot of research on this subject. And the consensus among those folks, those lawyers, is that it is not illegal when there's not money changing hands, that simply hosting the speech of such an individual who has that affiliation isn't against the law. So first of all, it's a choice when platforms make that decision, even though they sometimes do imply that there's a legal obligation there. Now, in this case, there's some details that I'm sure we'll get into around Zoom and what their terms of service actually say. But what I see on a regular basis is platforms taking down speech of individuals who are affiliated with, but also individuals who are criticizing, engaging in counter speech, parodying, engaging in satire around groups that the US government has decided are terrorist organizations. So yeah, it's a pretty common phenomenon.
Yeah, so you've mentioned, I want to see the distinction between the law, right? And you said you've had discussions with several lawyers and they said this is not illegal. And then you've mentioned, that's reference always the TOS, the terms of service, which basically, Zoom is a private company and can decide, now it's a publicly traded company.
Yeah.
But those are giant platforms. Imagine between the three of these, Zoom, Facebook, and Twitter, they really can determine now what's our First Amendment can look like.
Exactly. And if you look at Facebook, I'm not sure about Zoom numbers, but if you look at Facebook, the majority of users are not in the US. So if we trust the First Amendment lawyers who say that this is not the law, that it's not a requirement, and we say, okay, companies have the right to decide who they want on their platforms and who they don't want. What we see in practice is that it's often some of the most marginalized communities in the world who have their content, their pictures, their speech removed. And then it's some of the more powerful individuals, some of the more, right now, it's the right-wing individuals who often are not censored. And this, from my perspective, has a lot to do with whoever's in power in government at the time. So you've got a couple different things at play. You have the fact that we've given companies this much power to make decisions about our speech, but then you also have the fact that Silicon Valley is increasingly in line with the powerful, and that includes governments like the United States, France, Germany, Israel, and so on.
Yeah, so that's exactly. From what at least I've been reading, seeing, hearing, a lot of powerful organizations, even people say that the Israeli government has interceded, especially with Facebook, and it has done that in the past. Now, you and I go a long time and have traveled. We've seen things like this happening, and people were very critical during the so-called Arab Spring in Egypt that the government turned off the internet, or throttled the internet, and issues like this in other countries, Syria and so forth. Are we getting to this point now? So if we can say, well, we don't have government censorship in the United States, but now we have corporate censorship, and the corporation is now, or corporations are larger even than the government itself, that Donald Trump is dependent on Twitter and Facebook and whatever that they use. They're all kind of look to me like both of the same.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? Because on the one hand, you have smaller, more marginalized nations. Let's use Palestine as an example here, where I don't think Palestinians have much power to fight back against these companies. Not only because you do have agreements between Facebook and the Israeli government, for instance, but also because historically we see a lot of Palestinian speech being marginalized anyway on campus, everywhere, in newspapers, etc. But then on the other side, you see companies like Twitter trying to hold Donald Trump accountable, by taking down some of his tweets. And sure, we might agree with that. I think that there's a lot of complexity to these decisions right now that, perhaps an absolutist free speech take isn't always the right one. But at the same time, I think we've kind of gotten ourselves into a bind here where the lines between government and company are blurred in both directions. And I find that really troubling for the future of free speech.
So what is Electronic Frontier Foundation is doing about this? Really, you are basically an advocate for the First Amendment.
Yes. Yeah. So, I think it's important to note for the viewers that, the First Amendment doesn't apply to what's said on corporate platforms. And so we don't take that approach necessarily to Facebook, right? But we're still free speech maximalists, even when, we look and say these companies can do whatever they want on their own spaces. And so what it really comes down to for me is, sure, yes, there are policies that we consult on, we advocate about publicly. I think that for a long time, I've been against Facebook's real names policy because I think that it's damaging to activists. But we can't completely roll back the fact that these companies have this power. And so one of the things that we've been really focused on in the past couple of years is ensuring that platforms are transparent about the decisions they make, not just to the public through their transparency reporting, but also directly to users. So a lot of times users will get, very little notification, their accounts will be removed permanently. They don't always know that they're even breaking the rules. And that gets even more complex in certain languages outside of these companies' expertise. And then the third thing, and this one is, I can't overstate enough the importance of, is appeals, the right to remedy, due process. A lot of these decisions are made in error. Humans and machines are both fallible. And so we have to make sure that every user has the opportunity to go back to the company and say, hey, I think you made the wrong decision here. Let's look at it again.
What recourse do people have? I know you work very hard and many organizations to make sure that marginalized voices are heard and the lines of communications are kept open. And several organizations put these tutorials about internet circumvention tools and so forth. But now you have these companies are the ultimate arbitrators for free speech. So when the marginalized, when I have put something out there and they know they risk being shut down, what tools are available to them to not basically being taken off the air?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, I think that, one thing that I always tell activists and really anyone is that we shouldn't rely on these major corporate platforms for our speech. EFF's perspective has been to take a different view towards essential internet infrastructure as compared to social media and communications platforms. And so while we accept the idea that Facebook can decide what they want to host, we don't necessarily take that view when it comes to web hosts, for example, the folks that sell you your URL and host your website. And so that's an area, where I would advise people to look towards less central parts of the internet to host their content. I think it's also really important to look at what country your speech is being hosted in. The US isn't necessarily the best place for a number of reasons. It may have used to been, but now, I would take more of a look towards Europe for some of this. And then I think the other thing too is that, while I'm not right now, given the political situation, I don't have a lot of faith in the regulatory environment in the US changing in any positive way. But I do think that it's time that we look at Europe for this. I mean, we saw the GDPR come out of Europe a couple of years ago. Now we've got the Digital Services Act coming up. I mean, there's certainly troubling legislation ahead as well, terrorism regulation, copyright directive. But at the same time, I think that there's a real opportunity here to work with European lawmakers to make sure that users have more rights.
This is really interesting because I remember the days when the US was crying foul for Iran, not giving people access to Facebook. And Facebook, the same thing, they were also crying about this, that they were blocked in countries like Iran. And now we have to worry about, you're saying that the US is not the best place to host your content or to use these platforms.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed quite a lot over the years, right? I've just finished a book that's coming out in March called Silicon Values that looks at a lot of this. And one of the things that I realized working through it was that back when I started doing this work, and I think when I first met you, Facebook and other platforms, but especially Facebook, actually worked really hard, or let's say individuals within inside Facebook. I wouldn't actually credit Mark Zuckerberg with this, but they worked really hard to make sure that activists stayed online. There's a whole, kind of behind the scenes story about how they made sure that the page in Egypt, We Are Al Khaled Said, was able to stay up, right, even though it had been taken down for violating the rules. And so that changed over the years. And I think a lot of that has to do with political ambition on the part of some of those folks at the companies, but also things like the rise of the Islamic State, harassment, the alt-right. From my perspective, I would say that a lot of these companies have closed ranks and really stopped seeing themselves as part of the world and more as, profit-making mechanisms.
Yeah. What about the argument that's put forward that Facebook, like the old AT&T and whatever, they should be broken down to several companies. They've just gotten too big for basically, for this kind of control and this kind of power.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely worry about that. And I think, it's not something I work on directly, so I'm a little worried about misrepresenting EFF's position, but we do have a whole team that works on competition. And it is something that we favor. We'd like to see more platforms. We'd like to see a more diverse range of places for speech online. At the same time, I think that it's not a silver bullet for solving these problems. And I don't think that it's going to magically create a better environment for speech. The way that I see it is we have to look at this holistically from the legal side, and that includes competition, regulation, and fighting back against bad laws. We have to look at it from public education. We have to look at it from tackling some of these issues at the root. I think that when it comes to what happened this week with Zoom, part of the problem is that Silicon Valley lawyers seem to not know any better than to just follow blindly whatever the State Department says about who's a terrorist. I'm not going to state an opinion one way or the other about Leila Khaled, but we see this all the time where Muslims and Arabs in particular just get labeled a certain way by the US government, which I should note is not in line with what the EU and the UN say in every case. And the US definition is very politicized. And I'm just not sure that Silicon Valley realizes that. And so I think that that's an important thing to remember as well, that this is, kind of a group of companies that are really working in a bubble or in a vacuum, and not necessarily seeing the way the rest of the world both sees and is affected by these decisions.
What about hate speech? I mean, Facebook and other platforms, they claim that they're trying to clean their act when it comes to hate speech, but for Palestinian activists, they seem to feel that they're getting the brunt out of this, that their content is being removed. So it looks like it's been very selective. I mean, have you noticed this? I mean, is there keywords that people use, like whenever you have a post about Palestine, use the word Palestine or something like this, then all of a sudden that post gets throttled and maybe even removed?
Yeah, there have been so many, kind of mysterious situations with Palestinian speech on these platforms over the years. I mean, one of the very first examples that I had was trying to create a page with the word Palestinian in it, and it wouldn't let me. And, Facebook eventually said, oh, it's a bug, which is what they always say. But when it comes to hate speech and Palestine, there's an excellent report, I'm sure you're aware of it, but from Hamle, a group based in Haifa, and they saw really like a strong difference with how Palestinian, real hate speech by the rules, how Palestinian hate speech was almost always taken down, but Israeli hate speech was allowed to stay up. And I think that, we reasonable people can disagree on what constitutes hate speech. I mean, really, the world has never quite agreed on this, right? Reasonable people can disagree on what constitutes hate speech or how much of it should be removed, but what we all need to be thinking about is the holistic approach to this and how the bias that comes into it from every angle. I mean, there's always going to be bias when dealing with hate speech. And so we need to be clear about how we define it, and we need to be proportionate and balanced in how we apply it, how we apply any rules about it.
Jillian, I want to thank you again for coming on Arab Talk, and we hope to talk to you very soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's the voice of Jillian York, the executive director of the EFF, Electronic Freedom Foundation. And Jamal,
Frontier Foundation.
Yeah, she's spot on. I mean, we're seeing an emergence of corporate mega platforms, these social media platforms, being the arbiters now of what gets posted and what doesn't. And it's a very frightening development now, especially when it comes to academic freedom.
Yeah, I mean, again, who determines who gets on and who doesn't? And this is part and parcel of this whole movement now. You have giant corporations like Facebook and others. And by the way, when we talk about these corporations, their reach is not limited to the United States.
It's worldwide.
So the decisions that are being made in Silicon Valley affect people in Europe, affect people in the Middle East, affect people in Africa, all over the world. So that kind of, begs the question is like, do you need more platforms, right? Or some people suggested that, corporations like Facebook are too big and they should be, broken into several ones and so forth because of that monopoly.
Right. But Jamal, shouldn't we just call it what it is? We had the pro-Israel lobby yet again exercising its power and control, not just in a limited sense in the academy, which they have been trying to do for decades, but now they're exerting their power on these mega social media corporations in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. So the reach of the Israeli Hasbara is wide, it's deep, and it's far-reaching, and we're seeing the implications of it today.
It's not just the Israeli lobby. I think also there is intervention, direct intervention, and we know that for a fact from previous instances with the Israeli government itself.
Right.
Basically, and now it's opening the doors for other governments if they don't like something, if they don't like dissent. And, they can complain about this. And it's very ironic that these platforms like Facebook, they've complained when they were basically shut down from Iran,
right.
During demonstrations, and also when they were throttled in Egypt and wherever. But meanwhile, now they're doing that work themselves because initially they said we want to give, basically a platform, for people to exchange ideas and whatever. And I understand the issues around hate speech and whatever. This is an educational webinar. This is not in any capacity. And we should mention this involved other participants, not just Layla Khalid, but others. And yet they've managed to do this. I think this will be challenged. You and I are not lawyers. But
it will be challenged.
I think this poses a big question, and it's actually a scary question about our First Amendment, freedom of speech, academic freedom, that if constitutional lawyers don't take action, there will be more of this.
Right.
And my conversation with Jillian York, and she said, actually, if people want to do something like this, they should host these events in Europe, because there is more freedom when it comes to this. And here, the United States like to kind of lead the world and say that this is where democracy, and again, I mean, we don't even have enough time to talk about this, because this is an important topic about, for example, maybe in a couple of minutes, just your thoughts about President Trump when asked about if he loses, would he leave the White House peacefully?
Well, yeah. Listen,
and he dodged that question.
He's dodging the question. He's setting the stage, Jamal, with all of his criticism of voting, mail-in voting, not trusting the mail-in votes for Democrats. He trusts it for Republicans, but not for Democrats. Basically, what we're seeing, Jamal, is a showdown that is being set up for, if Trump loses the election and loses on November 4th, you're going to see a 2-month battle towards Inauguration Day, and the likelihood just went up dramatically of a real possibility that he will not leave office peacefully. That's the setup. It's something that I've talked about a long time ago, and it's coming to fruition. And I think it's coming to fruition, Jamal, primarily because he sees the writing on the wall, even though I still think he has better than a 50-50 chance. Before we leave, Jamal, we have to say something about RBG. We're going to talk about this more next week. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, passed away. She was lauded as a giant for social justice and for equal rights around women. It's important to note that her fight for justice for women was very exclusive to primarily white women. It didn't extend to women of color. It didn't extend to Palestinian women. She was completely silent on Israeli apartheid practices and the racism of the Israeli government against Palestinians. We'll be talking more about that next week on Arab Talk.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. You go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, and you can download all of our previous episodes.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week.